Chapter 12, Cities, by Richard Billows. Scholars who have written histories of the Greek city-states have most often tended to draw their histories to a close with the advent of the Hellenistic era, on the assumption that the creation of the Hellenistic empires brought the great age of the Greek cities to an end. This is exactly the opposite of reality, for in reality, the Hellenistic era was in many respects the most important period in the history of the Greek cities, a period of dramatic growth and development. Geographically, the reach of the Greek city was enormously expanded by the foundation of several hundred new cities throughout Western Asia from the Mediterranean coast all the way to modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not only was there a far greater number of Greek cities in the Hellenistic era, covering a much greater geographical range, but the size of Greek cities had increased. The largest Greek cities of classical times, Athens and Syracuse, had populations on the order of 100 to 125,000 persons, or perhaps as much as 250,000 if one includes their surrounding territories. A number of Hellenistic cities were much larger than this. Antioch on the Orontes and Seleucia on the Tigris may have reached 500,000. Alexandria in Egypt may even have reached 1,000,000. And there were quite a few cities that were as large as classical Athens and Syracuse. Besides sheer numbers and size, one must also consider the sophistication of urban development, both physical and cultural, and the nature of inner-city contacts and relations, far more elaborate during the Hellenistic than during previous eras. In terms of city-state culture, what is clearly observable is the extension of certain uniform institutions and norms throughout the Hellenistic world. Most obvious is the triumph of the Hellenistic Koine dialect over local Doric, Aeolic, Ionic, etc. dialect forms in all Greek cities. It is worth emphasizing that the Koine, or common dialect, was a slightly modified form of the Attic dialect of classical Athens, for it is clear that, as in language, so in virtually all cultural matters, the Hellenistic Greek cities modeled themselves on classical Athens. Attic drama was everywhere admired and watched. City after city prided itself on being a democracy. Athenian higher education in the form of Isocratian rhetoric became the standard Greek higher education, and so on. This same cultural uniformity, based in great part on the Athenian model, is found in infrastructure and accompanying administrative institutions. Several authors, Dio Chrysostom and Pausanias, most notably, present what is virtually a checklist of the physical infrastructure a city must have to be considered worthy of the term polis. Surrounding walls, a monumentally defined agora, a theater, at least one gymnasium, stoas, fountain horses, a council house, and or Prytanean town hall. And with this infrastructure went administrative offices, the agoronous, market warden, and gymnasiorchos, head of gymnasium, amphodarche, street governors, astimomoi, city wardens, each of which should be properly defined and regulated by administrative laws. In all of this, one can see that in the Hellenistic period, a broad consensus had emerged on what it meant to be a Greek city and on the basic cultural components of Greek civic life. This consensus was created and fostered by a host of inter-city contacts and relations of every sort, both at the individual, private level and at official public level. It is, for instance, common to find in Greek cities decrees honoring both individual citizens of other cities and whole cities. For benefactions conferred, these honorific decrees look remarkably similar throughout the Hellenistic world, and a very common element found in the explanatory segment of such decrees is a statement to the effect that the individual or city honored has done its best to be of service, both privately to individual citizens of the honoring city and to the city as a whole. The widespread proliferation of such decrees gives a clear impression of a community of Greek cities in constant friendly contact with each other. Hellenistic Greeks were aware of this and spoke of the oikoumene, the inhabited civilized world, meaning the world of the Greek cities. Greek cities arbitrated disputes among fellow Greek cities, asked for and sent panels of respected citizens to expeditiously set backlogs of court cases in each other's communities, made agreements to respect each other's sanctuaries as holy and inviolate, and in general interacted and cooperated in a host of other ways besides. There were, of course, outbreaks of warfare from time to time between neighboring or rival cities, but even such hostilities, so common in the archaic and classical eras, were mitigated in the Hellenistic era by the quickness of other cities to intervene with offers of arbitration. In general, one may say that the world of Hellenistic Greek cities was one of considerable peaceful interconnectedness. The geographical extension and size of the Greek cities. The idea of extending the reach of Greek urban civilization by founding new Greek cities in new territories was hardly a new one at the beginning of the Hellenistic era. The Greeks had already gone through a great age of overseas colonization between about 750 and 550 BC, during which the shores of the Mediterranean, North Aegean, and Black Seas were settled with perhaps as many as 150 or more new Greek cities. Available cities for such colonization had, however, been largely used up by the middle of the 6th century. Yet the Greek population growth that had fueled the colonization continued, as can be seen from the growth in size of Greek towns and cities during the late 6th and 5th centuries. During the 4th century, there was in the Greek world a substantial surplus population of political exiles, adventure seekers, rootless and impoverished people, and the like, according to conservative political writers like the Athenian Isocrates. McChenney, Isocrates proposed in various speeches and pamphlets, most notably in the Panegyricos and the Philippos, a solution to this problem, a unified Greek attack on the Persian Empire that would open up Western Asia to a new wave of Greek settlement and create a new life for the rootless and disenfranchised in new Greek cities to be founded in Asia. This is precisely what happened during the half-century or so between Alexander the Great crossing to Asia in 334 and the settling down of the lands he conquered into the three major Hellenistic empires in the 270s, the second great age of Greek colonization. This new phase of colonization had its beginning with Alexander's orders to found Alexandria in Egypt in 333-332. Alexandria was the first of the new cities in the lands of the former Persian Empire, and was destined to become the largest and most famous. Alexander followed up on this by founding a dozen or more colonies, mostly likewise named Alexandria after himself, in Inner Asia to garrison and hold down the eastern provinces of his empire. He achieved thereby a great indeed somewhat exaggerated, reputation as a city founder. For in fact, the chief credit for founding new cities in the conquered lands of Western Asia must go to Alexander's successors, Antigonus the One-Eyed, and Seleucus Nicator, and to more limited degree to their rival Lysimachus and Seleucus' successor Antiochus I. The end result of this colonization work was the emergence of scores of new Greek cities throughout Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and to a more limited extent also further east in the trans-Tigris regions of Media, Bactria, and other so-called upper satrapies. Many of these new cities were in fact continuations of old native cities or settlements with the imposition of a Greek population element, Greek civic institutions, and a Greek often dynastic name. Thus Susa became Seleucia on the Ulaeus, Sumerian Uruk became, it seems, Antioch on the Ishtar Canal, Gaza became another Seleucia, and even Jerusalem famously almost became an Antioch, sparking the Maccabean revolt. It was certainly normal for new Greek cities to have a substantial native population included in them, particularly the larger new cities, and this inevitably led over the course of a generation or two to the Hellenization of the natives thus included. Some ancient native cities were permitted to remain as they were, Babylon and Jerusalem, for example, but inevitably they tended to decline due to the rivalry of new Greek cities, as Babylon did to Seleucia on the Tigris, or succumb to the lure of Hellenization as Jerusalem threatened to do. In the end, there were well over 100 new Greek cities by even the most conservative computation, and each of them had in its way received the extensive physical, legal, social, cultural, and religious elaboration that was required in order to be a Greek city in a meaningful sense. That is to say that the structures and social, political, religious, and cultural norms and institutions of Greek urban civilization were now to be found throughout Western Asia as well as in Greece and the older colonial regions, and in fact, in some respects, these older regions of Greek culture were outshone by the new Greece of the Hellenistic colonial world. Many of the new cities, and by and large, the most important of them, bore dynastic names, that is, names based on those of the kings who founded them and of their relatives. Thus, in addition to a number of Alexandrias, cities named Seleucia and Antioch abounded, and there were quite a few named after female members of the Seleucid dynasty: Laodikia, Apamea, Stratonikia, etc. Usually, the many homonymous cities that resulted from this practice are distinguished from each other by some geographic designation. For example, Antioch on the Orontes, Antioch in Pisidia, Antioch in Persis, or Seleucia in Pieria, Seleucia on the Tigris, Seleucia on the Calicadonis. Other cities, usually smaller and less important, were named after cities in Macedonia, and the rest of Greece, Europos, Pella, Larissa, and so on. Although we have no reliable ancient population statistics, and although the physical extent of Hellenistic cities is often hard to figure due to incomplete excavation, the existence of modern cities on the sites of ancient ones and or the presence of a Roman overlay, not always easy to distinguish from Hellenistic layers, it remains clear, nevertheless, that many Hellenistic cities reached a substantial size in both population and extent compared to classical Greek cities. The largest Hellenistic cities were very much larger than the largest classical cities. Not only the famous Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch on the Orontes, and Seleucia on the Tigris, but quite a few other Hellenistic cities were of a very respectable size by any standards. This is hardly the place to give a list, but one may mention such cities as Alexandria Troas, Nicaea, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Stratonikia in Caria, Laodicea by the sea, Apamea on the Orontes, to name just a few. Population estimates for these cities are problematic and controversial, but few would doubt that cities such as the great Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia counted many hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Pliny, H.N. 6.122 mentions 600,000 for Seleucia. Diode, 17.52.6, claims purportedly based on Ptolemaic census records that Alexandria had over 300,000 free inhabitants circa 58 BC. And by this he presumably means the citizen community excluding Egyptian and servile inhabitants who will certainly have outnumbered the citizens class, and see Downey 1963 on Antioch. That cities with 100,000 or more inhabitants were no longer the great rarities they had been in the 5th and 4th centuries is also not controversial. Such cities of Old Greece and Athens, Corinth, Argos, Syracuse continue to be major metropolitan centers during the 3rd and early 2nd centuries at least. And newer cities like Pergamon, the refounded Ephesus and Smyrna, Stratonikia in Caria, Seleucia in Perea, and Apamea on the Orontes were certainly of this order of size. Of course, most cities were small, but it is clear that most Greeks in Western Asia at least did not live very far away from substantial city, and that there was a scattering of truly large cities, and in view of the greater ease of security of travel, it was possible for quite a few Greeks to at least visit a large city, even if they did not live in one, so that the experience of truly urban life as opposed to small town life was much more widespread in Hellenistic than in early times. Town planning and physical infrastructure. During the classical period, the so-called Hippodamian town plan, streets laid out on a rectangular grid around central public spaces, had become common, and during the Hellenistic era it was essentially universal for all newly founded cities as well as for refounded or modernized older cities. The basis for the success of this pattern of town planning lay, of course, in its simplicity. It was easy to lay out a city on this pattern, and when built, the city was easy for its inhabitants and visitors to get around it. It is, of course, for these same reasons that this grid pattern has been adopted in many modern cities, as very famously in New York, for example. There is no doubt that this generalized grid plan created a certain sameness in Hellenistic cities. Wycherley speaks of the mass production of new Hellenistic cities in Asia which took place under Alexander and his successors. And Green, quoting this, adds that their axial grid plans were as monotonously repetitive as those of the American Midwest. One should not exaggerate this sameness. These cities were founded in widely different locales, and the Greeks were very alive to the need to adapt their town planning to the specific geography of the site. As a result, there is in fact a great deal of variation in shape and arrangement of Hellenistic cities within the basic axial grid form. But without doubt, the sameness of the axial plan was an attraction settlers in the new cities and visitors between cities could feel at once comfortable at home in an urban environment that was basically similar wherever they went. How this axial grid town planning was fitted to the topographical realities of actual settlement sites to produce this basic sameness and familiarity, while at the same time responding to the features of the landscape so as to make the best of each site and introduce a suitable variety, can be best illustrated by looking in detail at some well-known examples. I will examine Priene, Ephesus, and Pergamon, three well-excavated and studied sites that show the variety introduced by differing landscapes, and also illustrate a different kind of variety. Priene being a town of rather moderate size, Ephesus a large and important city, and Pergamon a royal city, capital of the second rank but still wealthy and important Attalid kingdom. Priene was an ancient Ionian city which was moved to a new site sometime in most probably the third quarter of the 4th century, the very end of what we call the Classical era and beginning of the Hellenistic era. It is therefore one of the very earliest Hellenistic cities and is also one of the best preserved. Since the city dwindled in importance in the early Roman period, it has little Roman overlay on the Hellenistic remains, and the site was abandoned at the end of antiquity and never resettled. We have therefore an almost perfectly undisturbed Hellenistic city, thoroughly excavated under the German archaeologist Humann and Wiegand in the late 19th century. The city was founded on the southern slope of the Cape Michael Peninsula, overlooking the Gulf of Latmos to the south, though today, due to the continued silting action of the river Meindir, it overlooks a wide, flat agricultural plain. It represents an almost perfect example of the axial grid plan. It is basically circular in shape, though with irregularities to take advantage of the terrain, with public spaces and buildings at the center. Its axial grid is formed of wide avenues running east-west and narrower cross streets running north-south. The defensive advantages of the site are obvious. To its immediate south lay the Gulf of Latmos, and to the north a steep cliff on the top of which a fortified outpost formed a kind of acropolis, and it is surrounded from the start by a strong city wall. The complex of public buildings at the center of the city comprised north to south a theater, a gymnasium, a bullatorion, a prytaneum side by side, a grand stoa, and finally, again side by side, a two-part agora and temenos of Zeus Olympius. All basic civic requirements, political, social, commercial, religious, and cultural, were therefore met in this large central agglomeration. Two-part agora is noteworthy. A large main agora covering two whole city blocks was flanked to the west by a smaller area, roughly half a block, that seems to have been a commercial marketplace. This separation of the political, social, and commercial functions of the agora into two distinct spaces was quite a normal feature of Hellenistic town planning, as we shall see. A little to the west of the main group of public buildings spaces lay a subsidiary group comprising the Temple of Athena, patron goddess of the city, and a probably commercial stoa to its immediate south. Another important temple to the goddess Demeter lay in the northwest quadrant of the city, but the most important additional public space was at the southern edge of the town, a large second gymnasium and a stadium, undoubtedly built there to take advantage of the flatter terrain in this area. In its basic orientation, the city is dominated by the north-south slope of the flank of Mount Michael it sits upon. The main avenues run east-west because they thus are flat, and it is the narrower north-south cross streets that negotiate the slope, which is in places quite steep, reducing the streets to stairs. The city blocks, in effect, sit on a series of terraces, and most buildings, public and private, face to the south to take advantage of the open vista over the Gulf and the winter sunlight this terracing afforded. Many of the housing blocks are divided into 4 dwellings, each fairly commodious by Greek standards, though there are, of course, larger and smaller dwellings. In addition to defense and public buildings and spaces, careful thought in establishing the city was given to a public water supply. The water was brought into Priene from the mountains by aqueduct and collected in settling tanks, from which earthenware pipes distributed it to stone fountains set in the walls of buildings throughout the city. Overall, we clearly see a very well organized, well set up small city. It had all the basic physical features and amenities to be expected of a Hellenistic Greek city, often in an unusually fine form. Accessible by highways from east and west, it enjoyed a beautiful view over the Gulf of Latmos, to the headland on which sat Miletus to the south, and a small port town, Nolokos, lay not far. Based on the number of housing blocks provided by the axial grid street system, one can estimate the number of private dwellings as somewhere around 260, if one guesses at around 10 to 12 inhabitants per dwelling. That would give a very approximate population for the city of Priene of 2,600 to 3,000. Definitely a small town, therefore, though for the state of Priene one should, of course, add the population of the territory of the city-state, including subsidiary towns like the aforementioned Nolokos. Ephesus was, like Priene, an ancient Ionian city refounded at the beginning of the Hellenistic era, but a very much larger and more important one. The initiative in refounding Ephesus came, according to our sources, from the Diadoch Lysimachos, who ruled Asia Minor from 301 until his death in battle in 281. The city was apparently in decline at its original site, probably as a result of silting by the river Castros, on which it lay. And the site chosen by Lysimachos was by universal acclaim far superior. Certainly, Ephesus flourished in its new location and became one of the largest and most prosperous cities of the Hellenistic and Roman world. The topography of Ephesus is very different than that of Priene, and likewise, therefore, the town planning. Ephesus was built on the coast in a valley between 2 hills, Mount Pion to the north and east, and Mount Corosus to the south. The city has 2 parts, an upper city on the west slope of Mount Pion and in the valley between Pion and Corosus, and a lower city along the coast in front of and around the harbor. One of the best preserved and most thoroughly excavated ancient cities as a result of successive Austrian archaeological expeditions between 1895 and the present day, it is nevertheless the case that the very extensive Roman overlay, the vast majority of the buildings visible today are of Roman date, prevents us from knowing as much as we know, as much as we would like about Hellenistic Ephesus. However, as far as town planning goes, there can be no doubt that the basic arrangement of the city was set in the Hellenistic period, the Romans merely expanding or adding to what was already there. The layout of Ephesus was affected not only by the topography of the 2 hills between which it lay and at the harbor in front, but also by the hugely important suburban temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The main avenue of Ephesus, around which the street plan was established, was oriented with both the temple of Artemis and the local topography in mind. A processional way beginning at the temple ran more or less directly south until it reached the eastern Magnesian gate of the city, between the slopes of Pion and Corosis. There it turned west, entering the city and proceeding at an angle slightly north of due west along the valley between the hills until it reached the open harbor plain in front of Mount Pion. There it turned north along the west front of Pion to the north gate of the city, from where it turned east and regained the temple of Artemis. It was from this non-axial avenue that the street grid of Ephesus radiated out in two basic patterns. In the upper city, between the hills, streets branched off and climbed the slopes on either side in a basically axial way, though not meeting the avenue at the normal right angle. In the lower city, the axiality was more complete, as streets branched off from the avenue at right angles to the west and were in turn intersected by subsidiary north-south streets. Most important was the great colonnaded street later called the Arcadian, after it was rebuilt and decorated by the Emperor Arcadius, that led straight down to the harbor, bisecting the lower city. This urban layout, of course, meant that the public buildings and spaces of Ephesus could not, as in Priene, be concentrated in a central location. Instead, they were divided between the upper and lower cities, but always sited in relation to the main avenue and its subsidiary, the Arcadian. In the upper city, as one walked into the town along the avenue from the Magnesian gate, one came to the political center of the city, the main agora, with stoas along its sides, and on the north a boulatorion in the form of a small auditorium, and beside it the Prytaneum. Though the surviving edifices are all of Roman imperial date, Hellenistic remains have been founded under the agora and its north stoa, and it is most likely that Hellenistic predecessors underlie all of these buildings. In the lower city were placed an array of commercial and cultural spaces and buildings. At the point where the main avenue turns north lies to its west a second agora intended for commercial use, and linked to the harbor by the Arcadian. Originally built in Hellenistic times, its surviving architecture dates to the time of Augustus. Diagonally across from the commercial market, built into the west slope of Mount Pion, lies the magnificent theater, one of the most beautiful and best preserved of its kind. Its plan and the first two of its three tiers are seating are Hellenistic, though in Roman times it was expanded with a built-up skene and a third tier of seats. At its largest, it could seat 24,000, giving an indication of the large population of late Hellenistic and Roman Ephesus, presumably well over 100,000. The stadium of Ephesus near the north gate is Roman, but very likely on the site of a Hellenistic predecessor, the four gymnasia, near the Magnesian gate, near the harbor, near the theater, and just inside the north gate next to the auditorium, are likewise all Roman, but obviously several of them continue Hellenistic gymnasia. Though, again, the surviving waterworks of the city are mostly Roman, Hellenistic fountain houses do survive near the theater at the junction of the main avenue and the Arcadian, and just before the avenue enters the agora in the upper city, making it clear that the city's water supply was well intended to in the Hellenistic period. Besides the theater, the most impressive visible remnant of Hellenistic Ephesus is without doubt the long stretch of fortification wall on the ridge of Mount Coressus. Another small angle of Lysmachos wall survives at the northeast corner of Mount Pion. The harbor was one of the most important features of ancient Ephesus. determining its location and giving it its importance and prosperity. Though it is today completely silted up, its outline is still clearly visible on the ground, especially from the upper seats of the theater which overlooks it. A long, narrow channel from the sea opened up into a large, almost circular basin, providing one of the finest sheltered harbors on the west coast of Asia Minor. Besides the great colonnaded avenue and the magnificent commercial agora which it led, it is clear that some of the bathing and exercise complexes near the harbor served the commercial visitors who thronged Ephesus in Roman times, as did a variety of less public establishments such as brothels and the souvenir shops selling religious paraphernalia connected with Artemis, Diana, attested in the Acts of the Apostles. We can reasonably guess again that these will have had Hellenistic predecessors. The private housing was located in the upper city on the slopes of Pion and Koressos, leading up from the main avenue, and in the lower city mostly to the north of the harbor. All in all, Ephesus was clearly a large, successful, and magnificently planned and appointed city, one of the jewels of Hellenistic city planning. Unlike Priene and Ephesus, Pergamon was not an ancient city refounded in the Hellenistic period. Though it had clearly existed for centuries before the Hellenistic era, it was essentially a fortified outpost on a prominent hill overlooking the lower Caicus Valley until it came under the control of the Attalid dynasty, who, in the course of the 3rd and 2nd centuries, built it up into the capital city of a small but wealthy kingdom in the northwest corner of Asia Minor, which at its height under Roman patronage between 189 and 133 controlled all of Western Asia Minor. In terms of layout, it is virtually the opposite of Ephesus. As we have seen, Ephesus lay in a coastal plain and valley in front of and between two hills, and spread up their slopes. Pergamon lay on the top of a substantial hill and spread down its slopes. This imposed a very different town plan, and as a result, Pergamon is the least axial of the 3 cities here examined in detail. The natural topography divides Pergamon into an upper, a middle, and a lower city. As at Ephesus, there is a substantial Roman overlay masking the Hellenistic city, but the German excavations of the late 19th and 20th centuries under successively Humann, Dorpfeld, Wiegand, and now Rath enable us to grasp the city plan quite well. The lower city is essentially of Roman date, though there was likely some suburban habitation in the area in Hellenistic times, and the great suburban sanctuary of Asclepius, which attained widespread renown in the Roman period, certainly dates back to the 3rd century at least. The Hellenistic city proper was restricted to the upper and middle regions on the crest and the slopes of the hill of Pergamon. The division between upper and middle cities is not just topographical, it also corresponded to social and political realities of Pergamon. The upper city had at its core the royal palace and military complexes, and was rounded out by various public buildings and spaces. The middle city held the main residential quarters, but also a number of important public complexes. Noteworthy is that we find at Pergamon the same division into 2 distinct agorae of political and commercial functions that we saw at Ephesus and in rather embryonic form at Priene. The crest of the hill, or Acropolis, forms a long, slightly curving terrace roughly north-south in orientation. The northern 2/3 or so are taken up by the royal compound. At the extreme north end lay a set of arsenals. To the south of them, along the eastern side of the hill, lay barracks and officers' housing, and to the south of them again lay royal palaces built by various kings of the dynasty. On the northwest side of the Acropolis, across from the barracks and officers' quarters, stands the Temple of Trajan, built in the reign of Hadrian. Whatever Hellenistic building originally lay here was thoroughly destroyed by the leveling of the site for the Trajaneum. To the south of this temple, across from the royal palaces, lay one of the most interesting buildings in Pergamon, the Great Library, modeled on the famous Library of Alexandria, and it is said to have contained upwards of 200,000 books at its peak, before many volumes were removed to Alexandria on the orders of Mark Antony to replace losses to the great library of the Ptolemies. The library begins the sequence of public buildings and spaces filling the southern end of the Acropolis, for access to it was from the second floor of a stoa built along the northern side of the sanctuary of Athena, patron goddess of the city. This sanctuary consisted of a large open square with stoas on its north, east, and south sides, and on the west, set a slight angle, the Doric temple of Athena of early 3rd century date. To the south of this sanctuary again lay yet another stoa, two-aisled, of late Hellenistic date. Southwest from this stoa was a row of shops facing south and overlooking a heroon in honor of King Attalus I and Eumenes II. To the southeast lay a sanctuary of Zeus, with the famous great altar at its center, whose remains now adorn the Berlin Museum, and below it the extensive political agora, colonnaded with a small temple at its northeast end. The upper city is thus seen to be largely a display piece of royal and public buildings, fulfilling security, religious, cultural, and political functions, and making a proud crown to this great city. On the west slope of the hill, this public area was rounded off by a magnificent theater and temple complex. Built into the slope of the hill was perhaps the most unusual Greek theater known to us. To fit the topography, it was built with an almost vertiginous steepness, and it curved much less than 180 degrees rather than the normal 190 to 200. It consisted of 80 rows of seats and held some 10,000 spectators. The upper city, which like the theater faced west, was in effect curved around the theater, which thus formed its centerpiece and afforded the spectators a magnificent view west across the coastal plain to the sea. At the base of the theater was a terrace running north-south and providing an access road with stoas on either side from the agora in the south to the theater, and then beyond it to a small temple of Dionysus, patron god of Greek drama, at the north end of the terrace. The skein of the theater was set up on a temporary basis whenever dramas were staged on this terrace. Some little way down the hill from the Acropolis, in the midst of the basic residential middle city, there is a second large group of public buildings which included, as one descends the city, a temple of Demeter, the Prytaneum, a magnificent 3-part gymnasium complex, and a second agora surrounded by stoas and undoubtedly intended for commercial purposes. There were also two monumental fountains, and the upper gymnasium included an auditorium that may, given its size and location next to the Prytaneum, have served when needed as a bullatorium. Though it should be noted that, like much of the surviving architecture of the upper gymnasium, and it is of Roman date. Magnificent Hellenistic fortification walls, of which substantial sections still remain, surrounded the middle city. The three-part gymnasium is one of the most remarkable structures of Pergamon. The upper gymnasium, the largest and most elaborate of the three, was for general use by the young men of Pergamon, while separate gymnasia were provided for youths and boys, which probably doubled as schools for the youngsters of the citizen class. For athletic competitions, the upper gymnasium had an indoor running track, but a suburban stadium of Roman date may perhaps mark the site of a Hellenistic open-air stadium. All in all, it is clear that all the necessary amenities of a Greek city were magnificently provided. What is, I think, remarkable about these cities is the degree of sameness within such a wide variety. It is clear in the first place that to Greek city planners the axial grid system was an amenity, not a straitjacket. They readily adapted it to a greater or lesser degree, abandoned it if the topography of the city location called for it. It is noteworthy, in fact, how carefully Hellenistic city planning took topography into account and made the best of the physical features of the locale, blending with them, exploiting them, but never forcing them into the Hippodamian system where it did not fit. Where a city was built on a slope, in a valley, on a hilltop, determined its shape and layout, and therefore its particular character. Within this physical variety and the additional variety size, we find a basic sameness. In each city, whether royal metropolis, large commercial city, or small provincial town, the citizens' basic needs with respect to politics, region, social, cultural life, commerce, and basic security found essentially the same provision in the form of monumental public buildings and spaces. An agora with nearby Prytanean, Bouleuterian, and stoas to provide offices for magistrates and the like, temples and sanctuaries, a gymnasium or gymnasia, a theater, a stadium, and sometimes another auditorium or a library, a commercial agora with stoas to provide rooms for shops, city walls, and an ample and well set up water supply. These buildings and spaces might differ in size and according to the size of the city and its population, but they clearly conformed to the same overall conception of what a city should be. It was a conception that found expression, as I noted above, in literary works, and it also worked out in a whole variety of other ways in the life of the community. Associated with the various forms of physical infrastructure, civic life and urban culture. Associated with the various forms of physical infrastructure that made up the city were an array of political and cultural institutions and norms that framed and shaped the life of the citizens of their communities. During the Hellenistic period, the notion that democracy was the only appropriate form of constitution was an autonomous Greek city became part of Greek urban culture. Along with the political form of democracy, borrowed essentially from classical Athens, went another borrowing 5th and 4th century Athens, the so-called epigraphic habit. Democratic government required public record keeping in order for laws, institutions, policies, and the like to be out in the open and retained in the public memory. The way the Greeks kept and published civic records was to inscribe them in stone, either on the walls of temples and other buildings or on stelae set up in cult sanctuaries on the Acropolis or in the Agora. As a result, we possess enormous numbers of inscriptions from the Hellenistic era documenting, among other things, how the Greek cities functioned and were governed. From them, we can see that Hellenistic cities prized their local autonomy and democratic institutions greatly, that government by duly elected or appointed magistrates, state council, and assembly of citizens was virtually universal, and that the magistrates, councils, and assemblies of the Hellenistic cities were kept very busy. We can see that, limited as the autonomy of Greek cities was due to the realities of imperial power, the local self-governance was real. It was concerned primarily with 6 main issues: religious matters of festivals, relations with kings and dynasts, relations with other cities, honoring benefactors, the food supply, and the upkeep of public buildings and amenities. Although the public business of Hellenistic cities is sometimes dismissed as an unimportant trifling compared to the issues of real significance dealt with by classical city-states like Athens and Sparta, it should be clear from the above list that matters of real import to the citizens were routinely dealt with. And in any case, that attitude overstates the freedom of most classical city-states. For Athens and Sparta were exceptions. The most cities never had much more real autonomy than they had in the Hellenistic era. What we can see from the epigraphic evidence is that though Greek cities never at any time developed proper administrative bureaucracies, there was in the Hellenistic era a considerable elaboration of the civic magistrates charged with overseeing the various aspects of public life and business, and that the amenities and services cities provided their citizens likewise became more elaborate. One of the best pieces of evidence in this regard is a long inscription from Pergamon recording substantial portions of the administrative code of that city. There were detailed instructions for upkeep of the road network in and around the city, specifying the minimum width of main roads and side roads. The astronomoi are charged with chief responsibility for this, with under them street governors who have actual oversight of ensuring that the city streets are clean and in good repair. Those owning property along the streets are required to pay for the actual work of cleaning and repairing them when necessary, with the amphodarche overseeing them, and if necessary, the astronomy stepping in to contract the work out and exact the money to cover the resulting expense from the property owners over the astronomoi to ensure that they do their job are the strategoi and nomophilics. Precise fines and punishments are laid down for those at each level who fail to fulfill their responsibilities. It is strictly forbidden to damage the streets, and any such damage is to be made good at the wrongdoer's expense. The astronomoi are further charged with inspecting party walls and seeing to it that the owners keep them in good repair, with detailed provisions for how the cost is to be allocated. The astronomoi are likewise charged with ensuring that the public fountains are kept clean and that the flow of water is not obstructed, and to fine heavily those who misuse them. They are also charged with keeping a record of the water cisterns in the city and ensuring that they are properly maintained, fining heavily owners who do not do so, and reporting on this to the strategoi. Similarly, the city's public toilets and sewers are under care, with the charge to ensure that the toilets are clean and the sewers are covered. The astronomoi emerge from this document as important officials charged with crucial responsibilities for seeing to it that the physical fabric of the city was properly maintained. They reported on this to two of the top magistracies of the city, the strategoi and the nomophilics, and had lesser magistrates serving under them for specific tasks like the aforementioned amphodarche. One might also mention paidomone, in charge of overseeing the education of citizen boys and sometimes also girls in some cities, and various sorts of treasurers in charge of the receipt of disbursement of public funds. In general, it is plain that Hellenistic cities were rather well and carefully governed and maintained by a whole network and hierarchy of magistracies, which collectively saw to it that the city looked good and functioned smoothly, and that the needs of the citizens were taken care of. All of these magistrates were appointed by the citizen body and were ultimately responsible to the citizen assembly for the proper fulfillment of their duties. Again, it is clear from this that the self-governance of Hellenistic cities was not an empty honor, but that the citizen assemblies had matters of real importance to them upon which to deliberate and decide at their meetings. It comes as no surprise, therefore, to find that evidence exists to show that assemblies were well attended. Records of voters present at assemblies or of citizens voting in favor of a measure are known from various cities. However, discussion of magistracies magistracies and citizen assemblies, important as they were to the functioning of the cities, gives only part of the picture of how the cities were run. One of the characteristic features of Greek cities in the Hellenistic, no less than in the classical period and earlier, was that they tended to have rather diminutive public revenues, too small to meet all of the community's public expenses. Just as Greeks resisted the holding of salaried jobs, considering working regular for another to be demeaning and slavish, so they also resisted the imposition of taxes on their incomes, irregular as they often were, considering such taxes to be harsh and a sign of submission on the part of the taxpayer. This process of benefaction and honoring should not be dismissed as an empty or purely formulaic activity. It goes to the very heart of the functioning of the cities, of the maintenance of harmonious relations between rich and poor citizens, of the continuance of public spirit within the cities. Billows. The cities needed this active involvement by their wealthy elites, not only to make up for their shortfalls in public finances, but also because in the absence of substantial civic administrative bureaucracies, they relied on the personal business staffs and business contacts of the wealthy to get things actually done. By being willing to give their wealth for the public good, the rich of the Hellenistic cities won a public goodwill and gratitude that allayed nascent resentment about the disparity between rich and poor citizens. From Halicarnassus, for instance, a decree honored those who had provided the city with interest-free loans towards the construction of a new stoa, reading in part, so that those who have advanced money for the stoa, which the demos is dedicating to Apollo and to King Ptolemy, should be known to all. The controllers in whose period of office the stoa is completed shall inscribe on the side wall of the stoa the names and patronymics of all those who have advanced without interest sums of not less than 500 drachmas, prefacing the list with the words, the following men gave to the demos money without interest for the construction of the stoa. One of the most important benefactions related in the surviving honorific decrees was the provision of help with the city's grain supply. A decree from Delos, for example, honors one Aristobulus of Thessalonike, a citones of the Macedonian king Demetrius II, for help given to the Delians while he resided there in his capacity of grain purchaser for the king. Particularly noteworthy here is the clause in which the Histanians expressed the hope that others would compete to benefit their city when they saw that the Histanians knew how to render proper thanks and honors. Greek culture was highly competitive, and like everything else, public benefactions were seen as a competition for honor. Indeed, this competition to benefit the city and so win honor was likened by the Athenian orator Aeschines to the competition among athletes at the Olympic Games. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that by the Hellenistic era, there had emerged in Greek culture an idea of what a city ought to be, of a set of physical, social, political, cultural, and religious structures, amenities, institutions, norms, and practices to which all cities ought to adhere. This was not just an idea. It is very clear that the Hellenistic cities strove mightily to make it a reality. I will bring forward one final piece of evidence to illustrate this fact and provide a fitting close to this chapter. It has long been pointed out that in the Hellenistic period, the gymnasium became the most characteristic institution of social and cultural life in the cities, that frequenting the gymnasium was the hallmark of the Greek citizen. We happen to have preserved for us an inscription of the early 2nd century BC from the town of Beroia in Macedonia, recording the citizens' decision to establish a law regulating in detail the running of the gymnasium. The law was duly passed and inscribed and happens to have survived through the centuries down to our own time as an eloquent witness to the fact that Hellenistic Greek cities strove to conform to an ideal of what a city ought to be and made that ideal a reality so far as they could achieve it.